So I'm Ben Pollack. I'm 5'8", and let's see. Last night before I went to bed, I was 247. So I didn't weigh myself this morning, but I'm trying not to be too anal about it this far out. We'll see.
And go ahead and tell us how everything went at Michigan.
So it went well. Let's see. I ended up winning both my class, which is the super heavies, and the overall, which was awesome. That was the first bodybuilding show I've won. It was my third show. My first show, I entered both bodybuilding and classic and crossed over to bodybuilding. I was really focused on classic, and I came in second there. But so it went well. I was a little disappointed in my own performance just because I know I could have done better. I could have practiced my posing more. I could have not gotten stressed out and nervous the day before and kind of gotten a little bit flatter and waterier than I would have liked. So I was personally a little bit disappointed just because I know I can do better, and I think any competitor goes in with the mindset that they want to do their best. And, Justin and I were just talking about, Justin could do amazing at a show, but he knows that he won't necessarily be at his best ever. And so that's kind of it's a little bit of a plays with your head because you're up against other competitors, but you're also up against yourself. So that's something that I really want to improve on as we start prep for nationals.
Yeah, there's really two contests. There's the contest against everyone else and the contest against yourself. I mean, it really is, and for most people, the contest against yourself is the reason you got into the sport. So
exactly.
Talk about a little bit about so you did decide to switch to North America. What was the process and decision?
Yeah, so we originally did the Michigan State show. With the pandemic, they changed the qualifications for national level shows. Since I wasn't in top 5 at North Americans last year, I had to do a state show to qualify. And so our goal was to do North Americans, and because I wasn't really confident in my posing and my look on stage, I wanted that more time to practice. I'm sure Justin could have gotten me in shape in plenty of time, but I want to make sure that I do my best, right? And so I think giving myself that extra time to improve on my posing, to bring up some of my weak points, I think that'll be really beneficial.
Okay, go ahead and take us through the workout today, what you guys train, the movements, what you like about it.
Yeah, so we were a little off schedule today. It was supposed to be leg day. My knee has been hurting me just the past 36 hours, which has been a chronic injury for me. Started back in 2016. And normally I would probably have, been a little bit too macho and pushed through, but because I am in prep, I'm trying to be a little bit more disciplined, not hurt myself this far out. And so Justin was kind enough to call audible, and so we did back instead, rear delts and back.
Kind enough. He texted me yesterday with images of vomiting, telling me about the leg workout that we were supposed to do. So I was fine with the audible. Unfortunately, I was also up all night with anxiety because for the leg day I was expecting. But.
I love training legs. Is my favorite thing to train, so I was pretty psyched about that. But I'm just going to start taking care of the knee and make sure that I can get some leg training in this week. Probably I'll shoot for Saturday. It's Wednesday today. Give myself a little bit more time. So anyway, we did back. We started with rear delts, which are a weakness of mine. And so we wanted to try something new. Joe Bennett is helping me out with training to bring up some of those weak points, but Ann Sheehan, who's one of my teammates on Elite FTS, she gave me some ideas as well. So we played around with those. We started with a superset of rear delt swings. It was supposed to be sets of 50. We didn't make it to 50. Superset with Serrano presses, which you can see in the video. It's kind of an incline dumbbell, a chest-supported incline dumbbell press almost. And it was extremely challenging, so that was a nice way to kind of get some blood flow through those rear delt muscles. And then we moved on to the cross cable extensions, which is one that Justin showed me, and I really like those too. So we got the rear delts blown up before we actually started moving into the other work. Did you want to talk about any of those rear delt movements?
No, I mean, we're just that. Well, I mean, as a power lifter, there's certain show body parts that he hasn't really focused on over the years, and so rear delts are kind of for whatever reason, well, not for whatever reason, if rear delts are really where your width comes from, rear delts really give you an additional pop on your rear lat, on your front lat. They're kind of the last thing that sticks out on a lot of poses. Side chest, they kind of really add thickness to you. So they're really, for such a small body part, they're a really important body part for bodybuilding. So that's, I mean, outside the movements, that's why there's so much focus on rear delts.
And on a related note, Justin mentioned as a powerlifter I hadn't focused on them, and that's true, but it's also a failing on my part as a powerlifter because, my weaknesses in bodybuilding and powerlifting actually overlap significantly. So my weak lift in powerlifting is the bench press, which is highly dependent on the rear delts and triceps, and my weak body parts are the rear delts and triceps. So, there's that's not coincidental, but it's good to be practicing these movements both to build the mind-muscle connection to transfer to my bench and then to improve my stage look. So Justin has really been helpful with the rear delt movement, showing me some of the anatomy involved, making sure I have my scapula protracted as much as possible when performing the movement to isolate the rear delt and things like that. So after the rear delt, Justin did hamstrings. I did back, which had a lot of overlap. So we started with a T-bar movement. I was doing just regular T-bar rows, and Justin was doing T-bar RDLs. So I got the easy end of the stick there, and I really like this movement. I hadn't used this particular machine before. I'd used an Arsenal variation that didn't work for me, but this really got the mid-back and the upper lats pretty nicely. And I don't know if you wanted to comment on those RDLs.
No, I don't have anything to comment. You've helped me a lot on my hamstrings were never a really great body part, so you've helped me a lot on that. But I don't even know what brand that T-bar row is, but I've never seen it anywhere else. I've seen similar ones, but there is some. It's like a slightly different angle. Something's weird about it, and it's so old that whatever brand name has been painted over multiple times. So I don't know, but if anyone knows watching the video knows the brand name, that it's now that I say that, it's probably written right on the side.
Well, it also could be one of those custom-made things.
I think it might be because it's not exact. It's a little bent actually because all four legs don't hit the. It's real homebrew movement, I guess.
Which are always my favorites, but so then I went on to a unilateral low row. This was supposed to be a unilateral supinated movement, and I got as close as I could with the equipment that we had available. I do really like that. It hits my lower lats, which I kind of lack. I have trouble popping those on my rear lat spread, so Justin's been helping me with that as well. And so I'd like that movement for it. I think Justin just did regular prone hamstring curls, just a pretty straightforward movement. Hamstrings are one of those few body parts I think that are very difficult to really hit with with solely compound movements, and arms obviously as well. But hamstrings, it's just your low back will tend to take over if you're doing things like RDLs or stiff-legged deadlifts. And then even on things like a leg press with your feet high and wide, which can emphasize the hamstrings, there's still a lot of quad and hip involvement. So I do think isolation movements are very useful there. And then finished up with a superset of pullovers with a band and assisted chins, which I was really trying to arch my sternum and almost turn it into sort of a pullover movement as opposed to a pull-up movement. Just to get a little bit of a pump before finishing the workout. And Justin did a nice superset. You can talk about that.
Yeah, I did. From hypertrophy coach was lying leg curls for sets of 20, followed immediately by reverse band hack squats for sets of 10. And I figured the reason for the layout was that pumping up the hamstrings kind of gives you a nice cushion. It's almost like a pillowy effect and kind of warms up the knees. But kind of a side effect that I wasn't expecting is that the lying leg curls turns into a tourniquet for your quads, and so the blood couldn't leave, and so the lactate buildup was. The worst part of the superset for quads was actually the leg curl was incredibly painful, and then you go right from that immediately to the hack squat. It was kind of interesting. It's something I'll add to my list of movements for sure.
And then lastly, I just finished with one set of unilateral hammer curls, and that's mostly actually a warm up for tomorrow, where I have arms and some pressing movements. So that's to keep my elbows healthy was mostly the point of that.
So going forward, what's your diet been like, and what's the full plan then for national?
So Justin actually just changed up my diet on my request. We had been doing a very, very high carb, pretty low fat, especially by my standards, diet, and it was working great. But I was also getting pretty sleepy going into my training just from all the carbs. It was extremely high carb. Even on my medium days, it was over 800 grams. So we brought down the carbs a little bit and increased the fats pretty significantly, I'd say. And I'm really, really enjoying it. I have more energy. I feel like I'm just as full and staying just as lean. So far it's only been a couple days, but I believe the medium days are each meal besides the peri-workout nutrition, each meal is, I'd have to look it up, but I'm 99% sure it's 100 grams of carbs. Just switched to this Monday, or I'd know off the top of my head. 100 grams of carbs per meal and 14 grams of added fats per meal, plus all of my protein sources are a little bit fattier red meat. So 93% lean ground beef instead of 97. And Then we dropped from 3 high carb days a week to 2 high carb days a week, and then Justin has mandated the cheat meals, which I've only done one so far. It wasn't fun, but I made it through. So I think I had 6 waffles, half a box of Cheerios, 2 pints of ice cream, and an apple. That was as much as I could get down. I like apples. It's a cheat meal.
I can explain kind of the reason. Since the Michigan, because Ben always stays in shape, and so really what I was looking for with the diet was I really wasn't concerned. We weren't doing really weekly changes in precision, because what I was looking for is more the problem isn't so much the burnout. When I always say, like, I'll tell people I'm worried about burnout, and it's not so much burnout because everyone loves training, especially at this level. People aren't going to get burned out of training. They're not going to get burned out of motivation. You don't get to, like an all-time world record-holding powerlifting position without as being someone who gets burned out. But what does happen is you get rigidity burnout or strictness burnout, where you don't have the allowance, there's no room for variation. That's really where the burnout comes in. It's not the force feeding, it's not the eating clean, it's the fact that you, like with the low fats, you just have so few food choices. And sometimes you want to eat bodybuilding food, you want to eat meat and rice or meat and potatoes, but you just want a steak instead of chicken or something like that. So that's really what this has been, is just so it's been to prevent rigidity burnout or strictness, or that's not even the word.
I would say just straight boredom.
Yeah. So it gives us a little change of pace, and then once we get back in prep, we'll move more towards my traditional style that I'm comfortable with, which is pretty high carb. But I mean, maybe not. But I'm never completely stuck in my ways. Some of my clients that hear the high carb thing will be kind of confused, because they might be in a totally different approach. But I'm willing to adapt to whatever each person's body's like. But yeah, that was really the reason for Ben. It wasn't a progress thing or anything like that. It was just that he'd been eating 99% lean turkey for a year straight. So,
and at some point we had that flexibility, because even though I'm saying I'm in prep, we're still more or less in off season. It's just we're focused 100% on the show right now, and so at some point you're gonna have to suck it up, and if it's boring, it's boring. If it's painful, it's painful. But at this point we do have a little bit of flexibility, and so we're taking advantage of that. And one of the reasons that I work with Justin as opposed to other coaches is because he does take that individual approach. I can't tell you how many coaches that I really respect that just give you everybody the same plan, and yes, you tailor it to their caloric needs or whatever, but it's the same approach every single time. And for me, I'm a big believer in individual variation, and enjoying the process is, to me, the most important thing about being successful in your training. And so the fact that we kind of align on that perspective is really helpful.
When will you actually start your prep?
I think the plan is 10 weeks out.
Yeah.
So 10 weeks out, I actually have a seminar in where's it, Colorado. Mm-hmm. So that'll be kind of the start of prep.
Any cardio at this point?
Nope, no cardio. I mean, it's 8 training sessions a week, so don't really need cardio at this point, but I'm sure it'll get added in.
Ben's workload tolerance is insane. All my other clients that when I say no more than 5 sessions a week, I actually say that to Ben also, but he's the one person who seems to be able to tolerate, and he's good at auto-regulation. When he kind of gets overworked, he self-regulates that way. But yeah, when you're training 8 times 8 times a week and already lean, you don't really need much cardio.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and talk about your program a little bit.
Oh, yeah. So we actually were going through a relaunch on Myoplasmic right now. We had the opportunity. We've wanted a training app for a long time. If you've worked in software development, you know how much of a struggle that is. But we've actually partnered with a company that's going to make it available. So we're hoping, either late this week, early next week, we're going to be able to launch that, which will have both the kind of style that we've been following for I'd say 90% of the off season, which is it started with Justin's critical mass program that we tailored a little bit, tweaked to add in a little bit more strength work. So it's really designed to include both the sarcoplasmic training, which is your typical bodybuilding training, and it's pump work essentially, along with kind of the myofibril training, which is more standard powerlifting work. It's the heavy stuff where you're just focused on moving as much weight as possible with good form, safe form obviously, but a little bit less worried about blowing the muscle up and more about moving the weight. And then we'll also have kind of a guided coaching method, which is something that I really enjoy, because I can, the way Justin wraps his head around the diet is the way I like to wrap my head around the training.
Okay. And then you guys had some questions that people would ask you on your Instagram?
Yeah. So I think there were two questions related to prep that I thought were really good. The first, I think, answer might not be what people want to hear, but it's so when you're dieting to very low levels of body fat, which we will be, I'm probably a little bit under 10% now. I'm probably maybe 9-10%. But we'll probably try and get down to, a legit 4 to 5%, 4 to 6%, and that's going to be pretty rough. Even though it doesn't sound like that much, especially if you're a guy at 15%, dropping to 10% is not that hard, but dropping from 10% to 5% is much, much harder. And so at some point you're going to suffer. And for me, what I try to do, and again, this is something that Justin suggested, is in the off season you really stay away from the stimulants as much as possible. So all off season I was basically doing a cup of coffee as my pre-workout. That way, as you get into prep, you can introduce those, and stimulants tend to both increase energy and decrease appetite. So if you have those in your bag of tricks that you can bust out when it's prep time, then you have another tool in your toolbox to help you get you through when you're going to be dragging for the last 4 to 6 weeks.
Yeah, there's no way to be extremely lean and feel good. There just isn't. I mean, there's a certain level of leanness you can hold, but no matter how lean you are, getting leaner than that position is difficult. But the biggest thing, and what I always try to tell clients, and every client that works with me, whether we start 8, 10, 12, 16 weeks out, they want to do everything for week 1. Why aren't we doing more cardio? Why aren't we? They want to go right in full balls deep day 1. And the problem with that is that you have to be cognizant of the progress, because you should have a trend line planned out of, it shouldn't be just how I look. We should have multiple metrics of knowing that we're on track. Body fat changes, body fat percentage, poundage change, weight change. And what you really want to do is do the minimum work to stay on that trend line, because you can't add things in that are already added in. And the more things you have in reserve to help you late in prep, more stimulant, more appetite suppressants, cardio to add, things like that, doesn't mean you're not going to hurt, but it's going to hurt less. If you're doing double sessions of cardio, using ephedrine and Clen and T3 at 16 weeks out, you're going to be miserable because you have nowhere to go to speed things up or work through a plateau other than just suffer more later on in prep. And that's the biggest thing, is not getting overly excited early in the prep. And I say that, and everyone who just started prep that happens to be watching this is still going to get overly excited and start things too early. But if your coach tells you not to do that, listen, because that's really, it's always miserable to get it. It's not miserable being lean, it's miserable getting leaner than you are currently. And you want as many things in your toolkit late in prep to mitigate that.
It's kind of miserable being lean too, just not as miserable. The next question, which I do not know the answer for, how important is insulin sensitivity in getting that lean?
Less than people think, probably. I mean, it's still a thermodynamic equation. If you eat less calories than you burn, you're going to lose stored energy from the body. Now, insulin sensitivity decides a little bit how those calories are going to be stored. If your insulin sensitivity is high, you're going to be any short-term or localized caloric surpluses, like after a workout or something, those calories are, and specifically the carbohydrates and also the protein when they get converted to carbohydrates, will be more likely to be stored as glycogen rather than sit in the bloodstream long enough to get eventually turn into fatty acids and stored as fat. So I guess like the quick break is you eat a carbohydrate, just think of it as a chunk, and it gets in the bloodstream, and eventually your body combines it with sodium and water and takes it to the muscle or the liver as glycogen. Now, if your insulin sensitivity is high, you're very likely that carbohydrate is going to get stored that way, unless it's used for energy. If your insulin sensitivity is low, that carbohydrate is going to sit in the bloodstream longer, and if it doesn't get taken up to the muscle or the liver as glycogen, it's going to get converted through a different mechanism and converted to a fatty acid and stored as fat. And it's a very small change. You can still get very, very good condition with poor insulin sensitivity, and there are plenty of, and it's better now than it used to be like in the 90s and early 2000s, but there are plenty of insulin-dependent bodybuilders who are technically diabetic with high blood sugars who get in contest shape all the time. It's just not optimal. But it's one of those forest for the trees things that bodybuilders get so wrapped up in these minor things, they get so focused on things like that that they worry more about that than just doing the work. If your insulin sensitivity is high, it does put you in a better position for body composition, but it doesn't mean you can't get in shape either way. And of course, from a health perspective, you want high insulin sensitivity. But it's one of those things that I always say, paralysis by analysis. It's people who haven't been there, haven't done that, who are trying to get there the first time, read all these things on the internet, and all those things really do for them is convince them of reasons of why they're not going to get in shape. And that's not going to prevent you from getting in shape. And actually getting in shape is going to increase your insulin sensitivity. So no matter where your insulin sensitivity is now, trying to get into contest shape is going to improve the sensitivity. So it should almost be a non-factor. If your insulin sensitivity is low, starting a prep, that sucks. You should have been better in the off season, took more care of it, but that doesn't mean you should quit the prep, because the best way to get your insulin sensitivity back up is the prep.
And then the last question, I have nothing to add to that. The last question was, what is your training like going into prep? And I really like this question. This is more along my lines. So I think that, first of all, like Justin mentioned, I auto-regulate pretty much everything. I'll auto-regulate the loads that I use on movements. I'll auto-regulate the volume that I do on every session. I'll even auto-regulate to some degree what movements that I use. And you can even argue that today, choosing to train back instead of legs was a form of auto-regulation. I think that's very useful, but it's also something that I think needs to be kept for advanced competitors, because if you're just starting out, you probably don't know your body well enough to auto-regulate. And so what I would say is that for the majority of people, you're going to want to fall back on the dominant training paradigms, which are periodization. In powerlifting right now, there's a lot of debate about whether standard forms of linear periodization are really the most effective form of training. I think for bodybuilding that matters a little bit less. I think for bodybuilding, what you'll hear a lot of times is that you want your effort levels to remain high, right? And there's a lot of studies and research that kind of bear this out, that say, the closer that you train to failure, the more you're going to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And the problem is then you look at actual competitors, and many of them, let's be real, don't train that hard and still have phenomenal physiques. And so for me, I really think that for the most part, it's better to focus on your volume and intensity, just like if you were a powerlifter who was not kind of dabbling in some of the newer methods, but you're kind of going to go to the opposite. So when you're a powerlifter, you have a periodized routine. This means that you start out your prep. You start out with pretty high volume and pretty low weights relative to what you could perform. And you're going to start there, and then as you get closer to meet, you're going to decrease your training volume. So you're going to perform fewer sets, fewer reps. And you're going to increase your training intensity. Intensity doesn't mean effort. It means how much weight is on the bar, right? Percentage of your 1 rep max. So you're going to get heavier and heavier and heavier weights. And then at your show, at your meet, you do the heaviest weights that you can. Well, obviously in bodybuilding, that's not a good solution, right? Because you don't want to be lifting the heaviest weights that you can as you're going into a show. That's a great recipe to get hurt. So really you want to periodize kind of reverse. You want to start out with your heavier weights and your lower workloads. And as you go into prep, you want to lower those weights and you want to increase the workloads, right? So you're going to want to do more volume and more sets and more reps. And I think that's a very effective way to train, because that way you're not going to hurt yourself as you go into prep, and you're probably going to increase the amount of sarcoplasmic training that you're doing. So as you get closer to the show, you're doing more pump work. That means your muscles are going to look a little bit fuller. You're going to have a little bit better of a stage shape. Now, how much of an impact it's going to make, it's going to be relatively minor, but just like Justin said, insulin sensitivity also is relatively minor. When you're competing against everybody who's giving their all, those relatively minor things become somewhat important. And the nice thing about, if you are advanced enough to know your body and can add auto-regulation on top of that, you can make sure that even as your intensities decrease, your effort levels, right, how hard you're pushing, how close you're pushing to failure, that remains as high as possible throughout the entire prep. Right, and so that way it's a very nice way to balance. If you're using less weight, well, you're going to do more reps and you're going to do whatever you're capable of on that given day.
That's good. I got nothing.
Okay, people you'd like to thank you guys?
So I guess Gasp is my clothing sponsor. I also have a new supplement sponsor, Rising Labs, with that one leg monster, Casey Mitchell. I'm really grateful for their support, and then Pioneer supplies all my training equipment, belts, straps, all that good stuff.
Like to thank Hostility, or Hostile Sups, and specifically Hostility is my favorite pre-workout now. I've actually had to change my training times because it gets me, I'm not a very talkative person generally, but it gets me so kind of happy and hyped up that I'll come to the gym and talk too much. So I've actually moved my training to a little later in the day when less people are at the gym. And then R3 is my favorite inter workout right now. But Hostility Sups, geez, I don't have any other sponsors, I don't think. I'd like to thank myself, the Academy. That's it.